We've heavily relied on antibiotics to fight infection since the discovery of penicillin in the 1920s. In fact, many of us are able to pick up a prescription mere hours after being diagnosed. But this all-access pass may be giving bacteria more power than ever before. The more we use antibiotics, the more immunity our bodies build up against the medication.
This antibiotic resistance crisis is a global crisis that's been building for many years, generations, and essentially it comes down to the fact that microorganisms, principally bacteria, but also fungi, have evolved and developed the ability to survive and in some cases flourish in the presence of many of the most commonly used antibiotics used in human clinical practice and agriculture.
That's Dr. John McKillip, professor of microbiology at Ball State University. He says this issue isn't known so widely because antibiotics still work in much of the population.
If you go to the doctor now and you have strep throat or something pretty simple and you get an antibiotic immediately, it still generally will probably work most of the time. And so the public isn't really that alarmed yet, but they should be because those drugs are working less and less well as the years go by.
McKillip says antibiotic resistance has been a rapidly increasing issue since the 1940s.
The first resistant bacteria, the very first ones that were documented, were just a few years after the end of World War II, when Alexander Fleming, who really discovered penicillin and was key in getting it in widespread use, predicted that that would happen. And a few years after the war, hospitals were noticing some staff that were resistant to penicillin at that time. It was the late 40s. And in that time since, it's just been increasing. And really since the 70s and 80s, it's become probably one of the most serious global crises that we're not talking about.
Part of the resistance comes from our overuse of the drugs. McKillip says this gives bacteria an opportunity to adapt and quickly flourish.
Sometimes even within one bacterial cell division cycle, they can adapt and become resistant to multiple antibiotics at the same time. So that frequently means that within the course of, say, 24 hours, a strain of staph bacteria that was previously treatable with a whole group of antibiotics suddenly becomes resistant to perhaps some or all of them.
Meaning that finding effective treatments is becoming more and more of a challenge. Milind Patel is the CEO and co-founder of a biotechnology company called Pathogen DX. He says we're so focused on a quick cure that oftentimes patients are given the same dose and type of antibiotic, regardless of their genetic makeup.
You may be more susceptible in the saying that your body may respond better to antibiotics than my body. And so therefore, having a one treatment modality doesn't necessarily help for everybody. And that's what's happening is we believe that at the end of the day, if you apply the same standard of care, there's nothing wrong with that. That's what doctors are going to do. They're just going to write you an antibiotic. And that's what the standard of care is. Even though we talk about personalized medicine, the issue is when you have 7.5 billion people, you're not going to have 7.5 billion different treatment modalities or approaches.
But when the most commonly prescribed antibiotics no longer work, our first and last line of defense is gone. When a patient no longer responds to their antibiotic, McKillip says the bacteria often spreads into the surrounding tissue.
They've taken up these genes to be resistant to the antibiotics, so the physicians may prescribe new ones or different ones, or the same ones at higher dose, and they still don't work for the same reason. The bacteria are able to grow in the presence of the antibiotic because they have that resistance to it, and in some cases, the patients can die from that, many times unexpectedly.
A recent study published in The Lancet reports that more than 1 million deaths in 2019 were a direct result of antibiotic resistance. An antimicrobial resistance review from 2016 predicts that by the year 2050, up to 10 million people could die each year if we don't find a solution. Despite this grave outcome, McKillip says very little has been done to combat antibiotic resistance.
There have been no new large classes of antibiotics developed since 1989, and that's really very unacceptable. For the most part, the antibiotics that we have in use today are the ones we've had for the last 35 years, and they work less and less effectively every time that we use them. So big pharmaceutical companies are not developing any new antibiotics and haven't for many, many years, decades.
McKillip says new drug development requires a large investment of time, resources, and most importantly, money.
The reason the big companies are not doing that and haven't been developing anything for so long is because there's no money in developing and selling new antibiotics. They don't make a profit because you take an antibiotic for a very limited period of time to try to get off of it as fast as you can, and drug companies don't make money on those kinds of products. They make their money on drugs that you take every day, the rest of your life, for non-infectious diseases.
However, McKillip says there's still hope for change. A new bill called the Pasture Act of 2021 aims to incentivize the pharmaceutical industry by creating a subscription-based model. Essentially, drug companies would make small batch products for target audiences. Outside of the private sector, there's also research being done in labs like McKillip's. They're hoping to find new antibiotics by collecting natural species of bacteria from places like dairy farms and fresh water.
We screened about 35,000 isolates, and we've got 4 that have pretty big potential. Now we just need to extract the chemistry, the chemical that they're making. What is this antibiotic? And then rescreen it before we can move forward with marketing it. So it takes a long time, but we're trying to do our part as well.
The 4 isolates they've found inhibit the growth of many different types of infections, including salmonella, staph, and strep. But if bacteria will just continue to evolve, is developing new antibiotics a perfect solution? McKillip says no, but it is an important part of a larger answer.
Having new antibiotics is wonderful. We definitely need those, because right now we're walking a tightrope and there's no net underneath of us. And if we don't fall, it's fine. Everything's fine if we don't fall. But what if you did fall? There was nothing to catch you. That's the problem. So having the antibiotics would be like your net, your safety net. But if we had a whole slew of new antibiotics, it would only be a few short years before we're back to where we are now. They don't work anymore because they're overprescribed, misprescribed, and overused. And that's what's led us to our dilemma.
The next step is educating healthcare providers and the public on proper antibiotic use, which means only prescribing it when absolutely necessary.
Knowing how and when to take them properly for the right kinds of correctly diagnosed diseases. Right now, many antibiotics are prescribed for infections without even knowing what it is for sure, and at what dose is appropriate. So those things would have to be reevaluated severely.
When you get prescribed antibiotics, McKillip says the standard dosage is usually too much and tends to wipe out our immune system. While not ideal, the alternative would be making patients wait days before writing a prescription, an amount of time many of us don't want to wait.
So doctors feel a great amount of pressure, I think, to prescribe to the patient sooner rather than later, and that means taking an educated guess much of the time. And we can't do that anymore. That worked for a long time really well. Doctors knew what they were doing. They were right most of the time, but now they're right less and less frequently. So casting that wide net and giving you a broad spectrum antibiotic may not work anymore. In fact, it may make it worse.
Along with new drugs and better education, McKillip says we need faster technology that can immediately tell doctors which antibiotics will work and what dosage the patient needs. Fortunately, Patel's company, Pathogen DX, is one step closer to achieving this. Though its new test can't determine a specific dosage, it does give physicians fast answers to what antibiotics will work for each patient.
It's a DNA-based test, and then it quickly gives you more information for 200 to 300 individual tests in a single sample within 3 or 4 hours, and specifically giving you that level of information, which, for example, qPCR cannot do because that's too many markers and it's too costly for that type of technology. And then there's a technology called sequencing, and that takes too long. It takes days.
Within 4 hours, the Pathogen DX test can tell doctors the exact infection a patient has and which antibiotic will work in their body. But since we're becoming resistant to more and more drugs, we may need to start looking outside of antibiotics to help cure our infections. In fact, McKillip says the answer may be to fight fire with fire.
There are viruses that are called phage, bacteriophage, that actually infect and kill bacteria. And so phage therapy is a very old idea. It goes all the way back to the early part of last century, the 19 teens and 20s, with cholera, and it worked great to kill cholera bacteria in Europe. And just when it started working really well antibiotics were discovered, and everyone forgot about the use of these phage viruses to control infection. So that's another idea I think now is worthy of re-exploring. It's kind of like biological control without antibiotics or other chemotherapy. So there's a lot of things that we probably need to explore now and should be much more proactively instead of just relying strictly on antibiotics.
Though McKillip says we may be several years away from phage therapy being publicly available, it's a step in the direction of much-needed progress. Tune in next week when we address the industry that uses 2/3 of the world's antibiotics. For more information about Milind Patel and Dr. John McKillip, visit radiohealthjournal.org. Our writer-producer this week is Kristen Farah. I'm Reed Pence. Coming up next week on Radio Health Journal.
People have signed up to serve our nation and us, and we owe them the fulfillment of the promises that we made to them.
Why some believe America's veterans aren't getting the support they need.
Then should we be worried about antibiotic use in animal agriculture?
It's just a very complicated and difficult, complex situation. And, no farmer wants to pump their animals full of antibiotics.
All that and more on Radio Health Journal.
I'm Nancy Benson, host of Radio Health Journal. If you enjoy listening to Radio Health Journal, you'll also like our sister show, Viewpoints, which covers a wide array of topics from education to history to the environment. Here's a preview of what they're covering this week on Viewpoints.
If someone demonstrates financial needs, they should not be required to borrow anything. It should entirely be with grants.
Continuing the conversation about a lack of affordability in higher education. Then,
would you put a pet to sleep for a significant amount of money? Or would you alter or rework your child's college application if you thought it would get them into a college that they wouldn't otherwise get into?
Asking ourselves the difficult questions. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth this week on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
Listen to Viewpoints on your favorite radio station and subscribe and listen to shows anytime on Apple Podcasts and Google Play.
And that's Radio Health Journal for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more. And check Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify for a library of past programs. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and information about our guests at radiohealthjournal.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Radio Health Journal.